Today's story is about the roots of our Unitarian faith and how they stretch back in history in America to the time of the Puritans. When the Puritans first came to America, they built towns in New England, which is in the northeastern part of the United States. At the center of each town would be a church. All the people would go to that church, and they would pay taxes, which would help support the church. Every town had its church. And it was part of the Puritan faith that churches were free to decide for themselves things like their covenant, how they would worship, and who their minister would be. And so the people of each church called their own minister. Over time, these churches became known as Congregationalist. Each congregation made its own decisions, but they still knew they were in relationship with one another. Part of how they communicated with each other was by trading ministers. One minister would travel to another congregation and preach there, while that minister traveled to the other congregation. In this way, the congregations could hear other ministers and other ideas. But over time, some of the ministers and some of the congregations began to have more and more liberal ideas. They called themselves liberal Christians in a Congregationalist church. But others started to call them Unitarians. The people who said Unitarian didn't mean it in a nice way. They thought that this was a bad thing to be. There were Unitarians in Europe, and the Unitarians said that there was only one God. God is one, uni, instead of the Trinity of God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit that said that God was three parts. This argument about the nature of God was part of what the liberal Christians and Congregationalist congregations and churches were talking about, but it wasn't the whole argument. But the word Unitarian was meant as an insult. And then, in 1819, something important happened. It's called the Baltimore Sermon because it happened in the city of Baltimore. William Ellery Channing had come to Baltimore all the way from Boston to preach at the ordination of another minister, the Reverend Jared Sparks, who was becoming the new minister of a new church that would be Unitarian. The Reverend William Ellery Channing gave a sermon that day. That sermon was later read by over 10,000 people and became one of the best-selling printed sermons in American history. It was printed and sold all around the United States. Now, at that time, people weren't as happy with being called Unitarians. But William Ellery Channing's sermon was called Unitarian Christianity. "It is our name," he said. "We must not shrink from it." 2 years after Mr. Channing gave that sermon in Baltimore, over 100 Congregationalist churches had declared themselves to be Unitarian. 6 years after that sermon, a group of ministers created the American Unitarian Association. They were proud of that name, and today, so are we.